Good morning, everyone. Dr. Nicola Duchamp here. Today, I am going to talk to you about your adrenals, your adrenal glands, and what you can do to help them should they become tired. So just a little bit of background, your adrenal glands, we nickname them your stress management centers. They're teeny tiny little glands that sit on top of your kidneys, but they do a lot of work in your body. And one of the key functions of the adrenals is secretion of the hormone cortisol. Now, cortisol is called a stress hormone because when the body is under stress, and I'll talk about this in a minute, your cortisol levels can fluctuate, and that can cause all kinds of havoc in your body. So why is it so important to look at adrenal health? Well, if your adrenals are out of whack, be it high cortisol or low cortisol, it can give you lots of different symptoms. It can make you fatigued, it can make you brain foggy, it can make you gain weight, it can mess with your other hormones. And this is one thing that most people don't realize. If your adrenals are worn out, it's going to have flow-on effects to your thyroid and to your reproductive hormones. So what's interesting is that our adrenals produce a fair amount of our reproductive hormones. So that's true for men and for women. So for example, a female who is still having menstrual cycles will produce about 35% of their estrogen and progesterone in their adrenal glands. Right? We think of ovaries producing female hormones. The adrenals account for about 35% before menopause, and then up to even 50% post-menopause. And for men, it's about 35%, because testosterone is produced by the adrenals too. And of course, men also have estrogen and progesterone, and women also have testosterone, just in different ratios. Okay, so if your adrenals aren't working well, then 35% to 50% of your reproductive hormones, the estrogen, the progesterone, the testosterone, is kind of jeopardized as well. So rather than, when I'm working with someone on hormone balancing, rather than just go directly to, supplementing estrogen, supplementing progesterone, we can do that, and those things can be incredibly helpful. But we don't do them without looking at the adrenals. Because if the adrenals aren't working, then that needs to be fixed. Okay, same goes for thyroid. I do have patients who have thyroid dysfunction that improves as we look at adrenal health and support their adrenal function as well. So it's important for other hormones, but it's also important for blood sugar regulation. So where insulin and glucagon are the hormones that sort of regulate blood sugar in a very short-term way, cortisol does have a role on blood sugar management in a longer term way. Energy production for sure, sleep, good quality of sleep or interrupted sleep can be due to cortisol spikes at night, weight management issues. I mean, there's so many different things that if cortisol and adrenal health isn't there, that can go by the wayside. Now, how do the adrenals get messed up in the first place? Well, we call it the chronic stress response. So when we have stress, and I don't just mean like mental, emotional stress, hard days at work, etc. I'm talking about any stressor. It could be physical, it could be mental, emotional, poor nutrition, over-exercising, chronic inflammation, chronic health issues. I mean, there are so many things that can act as stressors on the adrenals. Now, when our body is under stress, the first thing our adrenals are going to try and do is upregulate production of cortisol, because cortisol is our stress hormone, right? The body says, okay, we're under stress. We need some help. We need some help. Let's send in more cortisol. So cortisol will go up in the early stages because it's a compensatory mechanism. That's our body trying to get back into balance, trying to get back into homeostasis, and kind of using cortisol for that purpose. The other thing, though, is when those stressors go away, cortisol can potentially fall. So in a perfect world, let's use the very cliched analogy of, the bear jumps out from behind the tree. You'll have this sort of adrenaline rush and a cortisol response to try and cope with that. But then once the bears run off and you're back in safety, your cortisol should calm down, your stress hormone should calm down. The problem is in today's day and age is that a lot of our stressors are chronic. We have these chronic stressors that aren't just like here one day and gone the next. They can be months, they can be years. And so over time, that chips away at the body's ability to produce more cortisol. Okay, so it's like our adrenals get tired. They're like, okay, I'm going to produce more. I'm keeping up. I'm helping. I'm tired. I can't do that anymore. And so ultimately what we see is cortisol levels then fall. So if we looked at it on a graph, and I know video is back to front, so this is going to look backwards to you. But if we looked at it on a graph and we've got normal cortisol, the first thing that happens when chronic stresses occur is cortisol will go up. And then over time, cortisol will fall lower and lower and lower and lower. And it can actually get to where the body's not producing much cortisol at all, which is not good. So it's interesting because when we look at lab testing, which I'm going to talk about in a sec, in the early phases, like if I see cortisol elevated, it actually tells me that the adrenals are sort of still compensating. They're still firing on all cylinders. That's actually better news to me than low cortisol, because by the time cortisol is low, we know it's been through that chronic stress response and we know that it's kind of gone through that process. So how do we test for adrenal health? I'm a strong proponent of salivary cortisol testing. And the reason is that you could go into a lab at 8 o'clock in the morning and get a morning cortisol drawn on your blood work, which is available, and it's fine. They'll give you a perfectly sort of, accurate measurement. However, the adrenals and cortisol do have a circadian rhythm. They're designed for cortisol to be higher in the morning because that's when you need your energy. That's when you need your get up and go. And then as the day progresses, cortisol naturally falls. And then at night, it should be low. And part of the reason is that's your body kind of shutting down for sleep. It's shutting down for the rest and the repair that can happen overnight. And it's allowing your immune system to come in and do the housekeeping overnight. So what I often see, though, is if we do that single blood draw in the morning, we won't get to see what cortisol is doing the rest of the day. And that misses a ton of information that can help us figure out what we need to do. So the salivary cortisol is 4 measurements. It's a spit test, spit in the vial, morning, noon, afternoon, and night. So we can see the pattern during the day. So I have some people that start out perfectly normal in the morning, but then by 4 o'clock in the afternoon, their cortisol's kind of fallen. By nighttime, if it spikes high, that could tell us that it's getting in the way of sleep. So what that pattern is like during the day or during a typical day will give us a lot of information about how the adrenals are functioning. Okay, the other thing about the adrenal salivary test is it will measure DHEA, which is another adrenal hormone. DHEA can convert to estrogen or testosterone. And so that gives us clues too. What's the ratio of cortisol to DHEA? Is DHEA low? Do we need to supplement with that? So it's a much more helpful test. Obviously, at the moment with, COVID-19 and all of that, people aren't really dying to go to the lab. So this is a test that one can do at home and just send off to the lab. Generally speaking, it's out of pocket. The cortisol part runs about 110, 120, depending on the lab. You can get reproductive hormones measured in the test as well. It'll put the price up to about 180, I think. But that's a different consideration, because for women doing reproductive hormones as well, it has to be done at a certain time in the cycle if they're still cycling. So that's a slightly different conversation. But The bottom line is it's really important to assess the adrenals through salivary testing so that we can see what the levels are doing during the day, throughout the day. So then what do we do with that information? Well, there's a lot we can do with that information, and this is how you can help your adrenals. Now, from a diet and lifestyle perspective, the best thing you can do for your adrenals is try to learn ways to shift from a sympathetic response, sympathetic nervous system response, which is our flight or fight response, back to a parasympathetic, which is our rest and digest. Now, this is where yoga may come in. This is where meditation may come in. Different practices, stress management, journaling, EFT, craniosacral therapy. Like there's so many different tools and modalities to practice helping our body back into that resting, calm place. From a dietary standpoint, the most helpful thing you can do is eat smaller amounts of food more frequently. Because if you don't and you let yourself get really run down and really overly hungry and blood sugar drops and all of that stuff, then that will actually put stress on the adrenals as well. So people who are doing like keto and intermittent fasting, this is not necessarily going to apply the same way, because if you're in ketosis and you've got your own body fat and energy to burn, I'm talking about people who just sort of skip breakfast, don't pay attention, then they're starving at lunch, then they have a huge lunch, and then their blood sugar crashes in the afternoon. That will actually be challenging for your adrenals. So diet and lifestyle certainly does play a role here. The other thing, there are some vitamins and minerals that are more health promoting for the adrenals. Vitamin C, B5, and B6 are the main ones that come to mind. The other category for helping the adrenals is glandulars. Now, this is more helpful, in my opinion, when somebody has very low cortisol, because glandulars are actually providing cortisol for the body. It's like giving an external source of cortisol while the body is kind of healing itself. And so I rarely give glandulars, to be quite honest with you. And part of that is just me not being a real proponent of animal products. But that doesn't mean that glandulars aren't right for certain people. I just prefer to use the herbal route because that's what I've always done and that's what I've had good results with. So in terms of herbs then, the most popular herbs for the adrenals are called adaptogens. And adaptogens are kind of like whole body tonics as well, but they're very healing for the adrenals. They support the adrenals. And the term adaptogen means that it's balancing. It helps the body to adapt, backwards and forwards, up and down. So if one has low cortisol, then adaptogens can help nourish and bring that up. If one has high cortisol, adaptogens can help balance it and bring it back to a normal range. And so for people who do have these levels that bounce around during the day, adaptogens can be ideal. Also for people who want adrenal support, who have not done the lab testing, maybe can't access that kind of lab testing, and you just don't know exactly what's going on with your adrenals, adaptogens are pretty safe because they're not going to be overly stimulating. They're not going to be suppressive. They're going to be more balancing. So some of the more gentle adaptogens, rhodiola, ashwagandha, schizandra, holy basil, they're really good, gentle, balancing ones. If you need more energy and a little bit more stimulation, then ginsengs can be good. Now, Siberian ginseng, also known as Eleutherococcus, is slightly more gentle, more balancing, less stimulating. And Korean ginseng, Panax ginseng, is a little bit more energizing, give you a little bit more of a boost. But for highly sensitive people, that can be too much. The other herb I really like for the adrenals is licorice root. And licorice root will help to increase cortisol, but it also can be estrogenic. So if I have someone who's really low in cortisol, I'll often use licorice root, but I'll want to check the reproductive hormones to make sure that there's not estrogen dominance, because the licorice root could then make it worse. With licorice, you also want to look long-term at can increase blood pressure, so that's another consideration. Maca is another adaptogen, and maca I also like if there are imbalances in reproductive hormones. It can be very helpful for women around perimenopause, menopause. It can be great for men as well. It can promote energy. So maca is a good sort of whole body tonic as well, but it is good for the adrenals. If cortisol is too high, especially at night, one of the nutrients that can help that is phosphatidylserine. And there's a product I use a lot called Cortisol Manager, that if somebody has elevated cortisol at night, that can help to dampen it, because elevated cortisol can get in the way of sleep patterns and quality of sleep. So we don't want that. So sometimes we'll use an adaptogen in the morning, Cortisol Manager at night. One thing with adrenal hormones, especially the more stimulant ones like the ginsengs, I don't give them at night. That can be too much. So sometimes we'll just do a dose in the morning. Sometimes we'll do morning and lunchtime, but typically not after about 4 o'clock in the afternoon, other than people who have elevated cortisol, and we do the phosphatidylserine or the Cortisol Manager at night. A lot of people can take adaptogens with dinner and be absolutely fine, but if you are quite sensitive and sleep is a problem, it may be something to avoid. What else? I think that's about the rundown. I think the important thing to remember is, if you are struggling with chronic health issues, or if you're struggling with hormonal imbalance, then for sure, look at the adrenals and take that into consideration, because that will have a big impact. All right, so I hope you found this valuable, and I will see you again very soon.